The Dawdlers' philosophy.
Snippets. Just a taste.
So that's the end of the general heading, thinking tools. And now I think we can move into one of Dennett's specialties, consciousness. Talk a little bit about that and some of the thinking tools he uses there. The first one, we'll just do another term that he created that has become extremely popular since, is the term folk psychology. And I think folk psychology is basically the manifest image version of how all of us learn to explain and predict each other's behavior. That in the concepts of folk psychology are things like belief and desire, and we notice someone pull out an umbrella and run towards some shelter when it begins to rain, and we explain that behavior by saying, oh, well, that person believes it's raining and desires not to get wet. And that explains those events in my environment. That would be a folk psychological explanation. And I think that's where things like consciousness would also reside, at least parts of it. Certain philosophers do more with consciousness, but it's also in folk psychology. Okay. So in those back, to use the cellular terms or whatever, and then apply folk psychology to it, then Dennett's job would be to attempt to make folk psychology scientifically respectable. Some parts of it might get thrown out, and some parts of it might get reformulated in terms that scientists might be able to get behind. One of his big projects that got an entire book is what he calls the intentional stance, and one can't talk too much about Dennett on consciousness without talking about the intentional stance. So, what the hell is it? He breaks it up into, so the intentional stance is basically doing folk psychology on a system. If you can take a folk psychological picture of something and explain and predict its behavior with relative robustness by attributing to it beliefs and desires and rationality. If you can explain a system successfully by making that move, then you have taken the intentional stance toward that system. It's somewhat unfortunate terminology, as often happens in philosophy. We've got this albatross term from the, I think, late 1800s or so, German Brentano, that we have this intentional thing. And what that means in this context is not doing something on purpose or with intent, but rather something is intentional if it has aboutness. So a painting or a sentence or potentially a belief would all be about something. So anything that has aboutness or content or meaning would have intentionality. And so since beliefs and desires are intentional objects, applying beliefs and desires to something is taking the intentional stance toward that thing. Dennett then embeds the intentional stance in a trichotomy with the physical stance and the design stance. So as a naturalist, materialist, physicalist type guy, Dennett thinks that everything in our universe can, in principle, be fully explained by only talking about the atoms and the laws of physics or whatever, the physical stance. However, given our limitations as chimps, we can very rarely successfully apply the physical stance. So often we have to jump up a level and take a design stance towards something, which means we assume that the object or system in question is an engineered object that has a purpose and that it is functioning properly. An example he uses here is with an alarm clock. If you show up at a hotel and you look at this device that you've never seen before, but it seems to have some red glowing digits and buttons on top, you make the assumption, oh, this is probably a designed system that has the function to tell time and to make noise when I tell it to make noise to alert me to get my ass out of bed. So usually when encountering an unfamiliar object that we choose to classify as an alarm clock, we take the design stance toward it. We sometimes drop back down to the physical stance when designed objects malfunction. My alarm didn't go off. What the hell's wrong? Oh, well, the ceiling leaked on it and it got wet. And because of that, some electrode shorted out and then the bell didn't go off. Whatever. So we can drop back, because everything is ultimately physical. We can always use physical stance. But when applicable, humans, given their limitations, will jump up to as high level stance as they can. So we go to design and then to intentional when we get to things complicated as animals or even some computers and computer programs. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. I think it's necessary to kind of put it out there in a little bit broader context, at least the terminology, because this is one of the things that Daniel Dennett does quite often is he comes up with a lot of terms for things. Mm-hmm. He's not alone. Lots of people do that. But he alone has come up with a lot of terms. Yep. Critics would say he comes up with cute new names for old ideas. But, you know, when you talk about folk psychology, that's part of, there's lots of people have come up with other names for these things like common sense psychology and naive psychology and mind reading, mentalizing. And the big one, I think, which is in psychology, they call it theory of mind. Mm-hmm. And so it's embedded in with a whole, it's a synonym for something, which is, as you described it, it has to do with, attributing in some way some kind of beliefs, desires, hopes, things like that to something. And I think the intentional stance gives it a much larger framework. It allows it to kind of operate within various, it's not just this standalone thing, a bunch of psychologists not caring about anything else but psychology. In this case, with the physical, the design, and the intentional stance, you have this larger framework that you can operate out of, and it just gives it a little bit more, not to make a joke, but gives it more elbow room. That's an inside Dennett joke. Yeah. Anyway, he has a book called Elbow Room for anyone